Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Summer of Sport 2024. I'm appending a year to it because I can dare to dream that Summer of Sport will be revived next year as well. This was an event created by Mark at Book Time with Elvis to fill a gap on BookTube, and also, I don't know if Mark knew it or not, in the mainstream book reviewing world. There, and that is sports-related fiction and nonfiction. It's sports-related nonfiction, especially, tends to be ignored, except for the big, massive, critic-worthy tomes that come out twice or three times a year. Somebody comes out with a great, big, 1,000-page biography of the baseball player Ted Williams. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal are all going to review it. But otherwise, a lot of this stuff flies under the radar, and summer sport is a time to read about it all, to go and find these things, read about, as I've done this summer, uh, sports that I would have any interest in, or barely any knowledge of, classics of those sports, classics of cricket or rugby or professional swimming, long distance swimming, stuff like that. Books like that have been a delight for me to read this summer. I haven't been making videos every day, but I have been sticking to Summer of Sport, and it has been one of the most rewarding BookTube reading events of the entire summer, even for the long stretch there where it looked like Mark had abandoned not only his own reading event, but all of BookTube. It's been really, really rewarding. And so I add a book to my nightly pile every night that is somehow connected with sports. I've been trying lately to muscle my way away from the rabbit hole of gay hockey romance, which seems to have been the theme for this particular summer of sports. So much so that I got a lot of emails yesterday. I talked about Barbarian Days by Bill Finnegan yesterday, and I sang its praises. Hopefully, I looked, judging by my emails and my Voxer messages, I alerted a lot of you to its presence, and you're going to love it. So I'm glad that I put it on your radar, so to speak. But by far the majority of the messages that I got yesterday, after yesterday's batch of videos, was people saying, no, no, you have to dance with the one that brung you. You have to read gay hockey romance for the rest of Summer of Sport 2024, because that is clearly the will of the gods. So I don't know. I may do that, but last night I was picking a book for a different BookTube event and realized that I was doing a rare 2-for-1 special, because last night I reread Riders by Julie Cooper for, of course, Garb August, because this is the story of the erotic adventures. It's the professional adventures as well, but it's the erotic adventures of two lifelong rivals. They're friends, but they're also rivals. Two gorgeous, magnetic, I've lost count of how many times their magnetism is implied or stated in this book. Two sexpots, one named Rupert and one named Jake. They come from opposite ends of the social spectrum, and they have two things in common. One is that they will roger any woman that moves. Their taste is so ecumenical that no woman in the Cotswolds is completely safe. And because this is Julie Cooper's incredibly sudsy breakout hit of a book, no woman in the Cotswolds is unwilling. They might be happily married or very young, but they're all mindless. This is an intensely sexist book in that way. All the women in this book are capable of being seduced against their own best interests, and neither Rupert nor Jake are, and a few of the other male characters in here are not. But the women are very much so. This is a very, very lusty book, in a way that I feel pretty certain could not get published today. Hugely enjoyable, anyway. Written just with glowing enjoyment on the part of the writer, which is I don't know if that's actually true for Julie Cooper. I don't know anything about the circumstances, the composition of this book, but it certainly feels on the page like she was having a ball, no pun intended, writing this book. And that means something. That definitely changes the reading experience, I think, for the better. So this fit perfectly with Garb August. There are shallow, one-dimensional characters. There's tons of gratuitous sexism. There's a tiny little shiver here and there of the gratuitous bigotries and racisms of the day. This was written in 1985, but it's clearly, I think, meant to I mean, it's written in 1985, and it is situated in the real world. The climax of the book, so to speak, takes place at the LA Olympics. But the feel of it, so much of it takes place in a kind of Benny Hill fantasy world that it gives off the feeling of the 1930s, the interwar years, out in the British countryside where the party roamed on hedged lanes from one country house to another. It very much gives the feeling of that, even though Jilly Cooper makes attempts now and then to make it feel very contemporary. And that animates this book. So you would think, okay, well, then why don't you make a Garb August video about it and make a different video for Summer of Sport? And that's exactly what I'm doing, Brainiac. I did make a Garb August video about this book, but when I was finishing it last night, it's a long book. It took me a long time to reread, even though I remembered, once I got going, I remembered parts of it. This is also very intently a piece of sports fiction. Very much so. In fact, far more convincingly than any of the actual fictional elements of the book. I have complained many times in the course of Summer of Sport, the few times that I've made videos, I've complained that, a baseball romance or a hockey romance or whatever, that the sport provided the backdrop for the book, but that it was almost not present in the book. And I got the distinct impression, I could be wrong, I got the distinct impression that some of the authors of some of those gay hockey romances or whatever didn't know much about the sport. Maybe Wikipedia'd it, maybe watched one game on a video, fast forwarding, but otherwise didn't eat, sleep, and breathe it. Whether it's baseball or hockey or cricket or rodeo riding, I got that impression because... the books gave me that impression, but also another thing did, which is that if the sport is a trivial concern to the actual players in the game, well, then you know that either the author doesn't know anything about it or they're intentionally leaving all of that out of their book. Because professional sports people are the second most boring kind of humans in the world. And there's an argument to be made that they are, in fact, the most boring kind. The most boring kind of human in the world is a drug addict. Apart from anything else you can say about them, a drug addict is incredibly boring because that's the only thing in their life. It's the only thing they think about. It's the only thing they prioritize. It's the only thing they ever care about or do anything about. It is their whole life. And that's very, very boring. Apart from the drama or the concern or the social anger or anything else, that's very boring. And the second most boring type of human is the professional athlete. And you could make a case that professional athletes are drug addicts. And so that they're totally addicted to either the dopamine of social approval or the chemicals that their body is producing when you get to that level of competition. If we, for the moment, consider them to be two different categories, they're certainly number one and number two. Certainly. They're number one and number two. Whereas other possible groups of people, little children, they're charming and they're adorable. They tend to be very boring. Also, old people, and by this I don't just mean your chronological age. I mean how old you've let yourself become. If you haven't learned anything in 30 years, you're going to be intensely boring to be around. Intensely boring. Usually we associate that with people who are in their 70s and 80s who are just done. They're just done. They're dried up little brisket pieces in the oven. You just have to wait for them to fritter away. But they're not interesting in any way. That's not always the case, but those are way down the scale. To my mind, always the number two, the first and second main contenders for the most boring type of human are, number one, drug addicts, and number two, professional athletes. And if you don't get that in a book, if you don't get something of the way that the sport overwhelms the athlete, just consumes their lives, well, then it's not really sports literature, even though you're billing it that way. And believe it or not, in Riders by Jilly Cooper, Rupert Campbell Black and Jake Lovell are the main characters. They're a whole gigantic cast of satellite characters, but they're the main characters. And they are rivals to each other in a whole bunch of different ways. But the main way that they are rivals is in show jumping. The sport in this novel is show jumping, which of course Steve does not approve of. Steve flatly does not. Show jumping is the sport. It is now an Olympic sport, one of under an umbrella of equestrian Olympic sports. Show jumping is a particular kind of dressage where you get horses to take fences and obstacles. By take, I mean jump in a very clean and stately way, so that it looks like an automaton is doing it. It's difficult work to train a horse to do that. It's very difficult work to learn how to work with the horse to do that as the human on its back. And the reason that Steve disapproves of it is because the horses don't do it voluntarily, and would never do it voluntarily. So it ought to be stricken. It is barbaric. If civilization continues in an upward moral trajectory in 100 years, your grandchildren, when they're your age, will be baffled at why it was ever allowed. They'll be amazed that it was ever allowed. They'll think about things like horseback riding in the Olympics or dog racing at a track in the exact same way that right now you think about separate water fountains for black and white people. They'll think of it the exact same way. They'll talk about it the exact same way if the moral trajectory continues in an upward trend in countries outside the United States. Then that's what they'll think. It's utterly barbaric. The horse is not participating voluntarily. That ought to rule it out right there. But anyway, in this event, there are all sorts of different ways to grade it. There are all sorts of different ways to score it. It's a relatively new thing, unlike, for instance, the discus or the javelin or long-distance running. It's a relatively new thing, just a couple of centuries old. The idea that you would need a horse to be really good at jumping over an obstacle, fences with moats on them and stone walls and whatnot, that only comes into prevalence once those things start to crop up all over the English countryside. Before that, you wouldn't have as much of a need for them. And it's incredibly well represented in this book. This is trash. This novel is trash. The characters are all one-dimensional. The plot is all suds and duds. But the sports parts in here are very much not phoned in, like so much of the sports-related literature that I have read this summer for summer sport. They're not phoned in. Instead, they're extremely knowledgeable and gripping. In so many of the gay hockey romances or the baseball romances that I've read this summer, we are told that the main character, whether he's grumpy or not, is headed towards the championship that will determine his professional future. Do you feel it? No, you don't. Do you see it? No, it's usually not narrated. Here, not so. Here, the world of show jumping is captured perfectly. And the reason that I have an inkling of knowing that is not because I've ever been a show jumper, but because I have trained to do it. I have trained in a large number of the different kinds of dressage that you can do, including show jumping. I was never good at it. I was never good at it at all. Not only because in the back of my mind, even decades and decades ago, in the Victorian era, we all did this. Of course, I was a famous Victorian jockey. But not only because in the back of my mind, the ethical concern was gnawing at me that the horse wouldn't do this ordinarily, but also because of the danger involved, because you can really, really hurt yourself. Think about Christopher Reeve. Out on a beautiful day, a hale and healthy young man with a long, incredible Hollywood career in front of him, over in an instant, because of a horse riding accident, because he fell wrong and suddenly he couldn't move, except his face. That can easily happen because the horses don't like it. So they may surprise you, no matter how well you know the horse. The horse may surprise you by refusing the jump at the last minute, or being so scatterbrained or panicked by who knows what, a flash of sunlight in the trees over there that you don't even notice, that it takes a landing wrong, or misdoes something that you know the horse can do perfectly well, that the horse has been trained to fairly well to do. They'll suddenly do it wrong, and suddenly you realize that you are a little piece of eiderdown on top of 2,000 pounds of muscle. And if it rolls on you or falls on you or stops dead in its tracks with you going at 50 miles an hour, you're going to come to grief. You're going to come to real grief. There's a skill involved in doing this. I know there's an old, I think, in New Yorker cartoons, unfortunately. And there's an old New Yorker cartoon from 100 years ago. It was two ladies on horses. They are riding towards a fence. And one is telling the other, just close your eyes and wait for it to be over. And that's not exactly right, but the key to taking fences with a horse in English style, where you don't have a huge pommel, you don't have a huge back to your saddle, you don't have crushing, killing bit in the horse's mouth, you don't have spurs. The key to riding English is to cooperate with the horse as much as possible, because you have very, very little in the way of coercive tools. And therefore, when you are trying to get a horse to take a fence English style, where you don't have those coercive tools, where it's bad form even to whip the animal, you have to let the horse do it. And that feels weird. That feels counterintuitive. It took me the longest time to learn even the basics of that. Once you get to the fence and the horse gathers underneath you, you have to let the horse jump without you. Your goal in that second, those 2 seconds, is to post yourself out of the horse's way so it can jump underneath you over the obstacle. And then you come back down and regain control with your thighs, with your lower thighs. You regain control then. But in that moment, the horse has to be doing it. You can't be controlling the horse. You can drive the horse towards the obstacle, and you can give the horse all kinds of signals of when I want you to slow, when I want you to speed up, when I want you to gather your hindquarters, when I want you that burst of energy, that burst of incredible energy that you can do. You can give all kinds of those signals. And if you've been working with a horse for a while, the horse will know a lot of what you want. It'll know your signals. It'll especially be able to pick up on your confidence. Because if these horses are going to do these things that they don't want to do and would never do on their own, they don't want an indecisive sack of crap on their back while they're doing it. They don't like that, and they're just mean-spirited enough to throw you off just because, if that's the case. So you have to bring all of that to that moment. And that creates a kind of mental momentum. But when you get to that moment, you have to stop. You have to let go. Not necessarily New Yorker style, close your eyes and wait for it to be over, but you have to let the horse do it. And the tension of that, the everything is on the line of that. If this animal falls on you, you could die, or worse than die. I don't mean to be cruel about it, but I don't think I'm saying anything that any of you don't think, which is that for all the good that he did in the years afterwards, Christopher Reeve suffered a fate worse than death. The fate that he had was worse than death. I don't think there's a single day early in the morning, he said in many interviews, he said to many friends, I start every day crying my eyes out for probably an hour. Well, I don't think there's any day that he wouldn't have said, this is a fate worse than death, but I'm doing what I always do. I'm making the best of it. I'm doing what I can to help other people, raise awareness, that sort of thing. Okay, fine. But still, that's the risk you run. If you don't die, that's the risk you run. It's a big thing, and it becomes really evident when you are asking a horse to do something utterly remarkable. Now, the most that I ever did was relatively short obstacles, relatively short. An obstacle would be something that's more than just a fence. Water is usually involved where the horse has to assess the ground. I did those on a level field, a course, and I also did those out in the wild. Actually fox hunting, both in America and the United States, where there you don't know what you're going to encounter. The horse has to be a little bit more rough and tumble than the ones that are specifically trained for show jumping. They have to be a little bit more rough and tumble than that, because you're going to ask them to take an obstacle that they've never seen before and just trust you. And that I've done both of those things, only to a limited extent, 5-6 feet, something like that, or a half-buried stone wall out in the wilds, on somebody's actual property, where I don't know what's on the other side of it, and neither does the horse. We're going to do our best. We're going to assume there's nice solid ground on the other side of it instead of a stream or rough ground or a drop, and you will just do it. When you're involved, when you're involved in a chase like that, your blood is up, and so is the horse's, and you don't really care quite so much. I in those cases, out in the wild, in the unstructured areas, I had the psychological benefit of knowing that no harm would come to the fox. I had taken care of no harm would come to the fox, and the dogs were in heaven. Dogs in a crowd, in a pack, that are on scent and in voice, they are giving full bell for a prey animal of any kind, are in heaven. They are as happy as dogs on earth can get. And that was worth it to me, to see that. But every once in a while, I had to worry about my neck, quite literally, because I was taking a horse at speed over terrain that I had never seen before. And there's all of both of that in this book. The sport of show riding, show jumping, of riding just in general is so wonderfully captured in this book. Probably 300 of its 800 pages are devoted to that in prose that's really good. I don't think I've encountered its equal. So I thought this made a legitimate candidate for Summer of Sport. This is actually the only way in which this book is good is as an evocation of the sport of the riding world, of the horsey set, and eventually of the actual sport of show jumping for the Olympics. So I think this is fair. So there you go. It's a twofer for BookTube events. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.